Christmas Eve shimmered through the windows, wrapping the house in gold and laughter. The table was perfect, candles glowing, roast steaming, the grandkids whispering secrets between bites. I sat at the head, the same seat my late husband, Arthur, once claimed every year. It wasn't just a chair, it was a memory, our memory. Then Maris, my daughter, walked in, her voice cutting through the warmth. "Mom, could you move, please? That's Victoria's seat." At first, I thought she was joking, but her eyes didn't blink. The room turned silent, heavy. Even the silverware paused midair. I said gently, "Sweetheart, this has always been my seat." She sighed, sharper now. "Not anymore." Then she reached out and pushed. The chair tipped, the world blurred. I hit the floor, pain searing through my hip, pride shattering louder than the crash. From the corner, my grandson's voice trembled. "Grandma?" No one moved, not even Maris. I looked up at the chair, now empty, and whispered, "They forgot who built this family." Then, under my breath, a promise rose. But I haven't forgotten the power of my signature. Hi everyone, I'm Eleanor Hartley. People often say that age makes you gentle, that with time you stop fighting and start forgiving. But I've learned that even the kindest hearts have limits, and when those limits are crossed, silence can become your sharpest weapon. Before I begin, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Do it for every mother, grandmother, and quiet soul who's ever been told to step aside. Because sometimes the stories that whisper the softest truths are the ones the world needs to hear the loudest. Now, let me take you back to the night everything changed. The house smelled of cinnamon and roasted turkey. The grandkids were laughing, the candles flickered against the window glass, and for a brief moment, everything felt peaceful, almost sacred. I remember thinking, this is what family is meant to feel like. But peace is fragile. It breaks quietly, without warning. And that night, it shattered with just one sentence. One that I never thought would come from my own daughter's lips. That was the night I learned love built this home, but respect was the foundation holding it up, and they had forgotten that. The table was a masterpiece. Gold-rimmed plates, candles flickering like tiny hearts, and laughter spilling between clinks of cutlery. For a moment, I believed the years of sacrifice were worth it. My daughter, Maurice, had finally gathered everyone for Christmas dinner, something we hadn't done since Arthur, my husband, passed. But when she entered the room, the air changed. She looked stunning, yes, red dress, pearls glinting, but her eyes had lost warmth. Behind her trailed Daniel, her husband, his shoulders stiff, and then her, Victoria, Daniel's mother, the woman who always smiled as if she owned the world. "Mom," Maurice began softly, her tone laced with that new, polished authority, "could you please move? That seat's for Victoria." At first I laughed, just a quiet chuckle. Surely she was joking. My hand brushed the chair's arm, the very one Arthur had built when we bought this house. "Sweetheart, you know this has always been my seat," I said gently. Her lips tightened. "Yes, but things are different now." The silence that followed was heavy, so heavy that even the ticking clock seemed to stop. My grandson's fork slipped from his hand. Then it happened. She reached out and pushed. My world spun. The candlelight blurred into streaks of gold as my chair tipped backward. Pain shot through my hip when I hit the floor, but the ache in my chest burned deeper. Daniel stepped forward, uncertain, then froze under Victoria's sharp glance. No one moved. Only my grandson's whisper broke the silence. "Grandma?" I looked up at the chair, now empty. My chair, and something inside me shifted. They forgot who built this family, I thought, but I hadn't forgotten the power of my signature. The night air bit into my skin as I limped out of my daughter's house, clutching my coat against the wind. The pain in my hip throbbed with every step, but the ache in my heart was louder.
Snowflakes fell slow and silent, the kind of silence that follows betrayal. My car engine coughed to life, headlights slicing through the dark as I drove towards the old farmhouse Arthur and I built brick by brick. That drive felt endless. Each passing mile whispered memories. Arthur's laugh, the sound of our children running barefoot through the fields, the smell of rain-soaked soil after harvest. By the time I reached the house, my tears had dried, replaced by something far colder, resolve. Inside, the farmhouse was still, frozen in time. His armchair sat by the window, his pipe on the mantel, untouched. I placed my trembling hand on the back of the chair and whispered, "Arthur, they've forgotten." My voice cracked, but I remember. I made my way to the study and opened the cedar cabinet he'd carved with his own hands. Behind a stack of old photo albums sat a small, fireproof box, untouched for years. The key was still in my jewelry box, warm from my palm. When I opened it, the soft click sounded like thunder. Inside lay every piece of paper that proved where True Power rested: deeds, shares, and the signatures that had built my daughter's comfort, her husband's business, and their entire life. The memories burned brighter than the pain. I sat at the desk, the documents spread before me like a deck of fate, and whispered, "You built your world with my hands, Maurice. Now let's see how you stand when I take them back."
The fire crackled softly as I spread the papers across the oak desk. Old ink, old promises, and old power. Each document was a reminder of how many times I had saved them without asking for thanks. The farmhouse deed, the business loan, the shares in Hartley Construction, all signed by the same trembling hand. Mine. I remembered the day Daniel came to me years ago, eyes full of fear and pride. "We just need a little help to get started, Mom. I swear we'll pay you back." Arthur had believed in him, said he had potential. So I wrote the check, smiling, thinking family meant trust. Now that same trust had turned to betrayal, dressed in silk and manners. They'd built their empire on my foundation, yet they had the nerve to act like I was the burden. I ran my fingers over the embossed seal, the ownership papers still crisp despite the years. 35% of the company, my name right beside Daniel's. Without my signature, nothing moved, nothing grew. A slow smile crept across my face, not of revenge, but of quiet justice. They had mistaken my silence for weakness. I closed the box, locking it with a soft click that sounded like destiny. "They thought the queen had fallen," I murmured, staring into the fire. "But the board still moves at her command." Tomorrow they would learn. Not all power shouts. Some simply signs its name. By morning, the bitterness had cooled into clarity. I brewed a pot of tea, strong and steady, and sat by the window as the frost painted white lace across the glass. The farmhouse was silent, the kind of silence that feels like planning. I opened the fireproof box once more and studied every clause, each number, each signature burned itself into memory. If they wanted to play power, I'd show them where real power sleeps, in ink, in patience, and in timing. At exactly 9 a.m., I made the first call. "Ruth," I said, my voice calm that edged, "revoke every proxy Daniel and Maris hold in Hartley Construction, effective immediately." There was a pause, then a quiet, respectful reply. "Understood, Mrs. Hartley." Next, I dialed Marcus, my accountant. "Freeze all joint transfers. Every account connected to my name, I want it locked." His breath caught. "That will cut them completely off." "That's the point," I said, stirring my tea. "Let's see how they live without my shadow funding their light." Finally, I called a locksmith. "The guest house," I said. "Change every lock.
today. When I hung up, I looked around the room, Arthur's portrait smiling faintly in the dim light. I'm not angry, love. I'm awake. Outside, the first sunlight touched the snow. By sunset, their comfort would start to melt, one quiet decision at a time.
The next morning arrived with a strange, deceptive calm, the kind that whispers of peace while hiding a brewing storm behind its quiet face. The sky hung low, heavy with mist, as if nature itself was holding its breath. I sat by the window, my fingers curled around a warm cup of tea, watching the fog drift across the fields like a ghost. Every breath of air carried a promise, not of revenge, but of balance finally returning home. Somewhere beyond that haze, their perfect little world, polished, loud, and ungrateful, had started to crack. I didn't smile out of cruelty, I smiled out of relief. For years, I had been the foundation they built upon, and like any foundation, I had gone unseen. But this morning, they were finally learning what happens when the ground decides to move. At 7 a.m., the first call came. Daniel. His voice was tight, clipped, the tone of a man whose certainty had just met reality. Daniel stammered, There's been a mistake with the bank. Our mortgage payment didn't go through." I swirled the tea in my cup. "That's odd," I said gently. "You might want to check the ownership records." Then I ended the call. By 8 a.m., Maris's voice replaced his. "Mom, my card just got declined at the grocery store. Did you change something?" Her irritation couldn't mask the tremor in her words. "Sweetheart," I said softly, "sometimes things freeze when they've been too comfortable for too long." By 9 a.m., the air was thick with panic. Daniel's company payroll had been frozen. His phone buzzed endlessly. Employees, creditors, clients. He tried to reach Ruth, but she wouldn't answer. The empire built on borrowed respect and forgotten gratitude was crumbling faster than their pride could rebuild it. At noon, I finally picked up my phone. I typed a single message. 5 p.m., Church Hall. Bring nothing but honesty. I set the phone down, exhaled slowly, and listened to the quiet hum of the farmhouse. It no longer felt heavy or haunted. It felt free, alive. They had taken my chair once, thinking I was done sitting at the table. But today, I hadn't just taken it back. I'd reminded them who built the house it stood in. The church smelled of old wood and candle wax, that sacred mixture of age and memory. Light filtered through the stained glass windows in soft streaks of gold and crimson, painting the floor like a confession. This was the same hall where Maris once sang in the children's choir, her laughter rising with every note. Back then, I used to sit in the front pew, proud and tearful. But today, the same air carried a different hymn, one of truth and consequence. I sat at the front table, the papers neatly aligned beside me, bank documents, ownership deeds, and the folded letter from my lawyer. My cane rested against the chair, not as a symbol of fragility, but as a reminder. I had stumbled, not fallen. I was here to rise, not to beg. At exactly 5 o'clock, the heavy wooden doors groaned open. The sound echoed down the aisle like judgment arriving on cue. Maris entered first, eyes red, hands clasped tight, guilt softening her steps. Behind her came Daniel, shoulders rigid, pride barely holding his fear together. And then Victoria, perfectly composed, arrogance trailing behind her like expensive perfume. "Mother," Maris whispered, her voice shaking, This isn't necessary."
I lifted my gaze slowly. Oh, my dear, it's long overdue. I gestured toward the 3 chairs across from me. Sit. They obeyed, though the scrape of the chairs across the floor sounded like protest. I spoke quietly, yet the hall carried every word. 4 conditions, not requests, consequences. I raised one finger. A public apology, not whispered in corners, but spoken where truth can hear it. Another, every company proxy, revoked. I built that trust, and now it returns home. Then 6 weeks of community service, together. You'll learn what it means to build, not just own. And finally, my grandchildren, visits without permission, without excuses. Victoria's laugh was brittle. You've lost your place, Eleanor. I leaned forward, eyes steady, voice low. No, Victoria, I've reclaimed it. You just mistook silence for surrender. Outside, the bell tower began to toll, slow, resonant, undeniable. Each chime rolled through the rafters like thunder finding its voice, announcing not vengeance, but the return of justice that had been waiting far too long.
The final echo of the church bell faded into the air, leaving behind a silence so heavy it almost had shape. None of them spoke. For the first time, my children, grown, powerful, polished, looked small, the kind of small that comes when pride cracks and truth seeps in. Maris's eyes were wet, trembling with 1,000 unsaid apologies. She stared at her hands, her wedding ring twisting nervously between her fingers. Daniel sat rigid, jaw tight, but I could see the boy he once was, the one who used to hold my hand when crossing the street. And Victoria? She tried to keep her armor on, but even she couldn't hide the way her gaze flickered, that split second of recognition that perhaps, for once, she'd underestimated the quiet woman before her. The church creaked as I stood, leaning slightly on my cane. "You think this is punishment," I said softly, my voice steady, calm. "It's not. It's a reminder that family isn't built on control, it's built on care, and care demands respect." Maris finally whispered, "Mom, we didn't mean to—" I raised a hand gently. "I know, but meaning well isn't the same as doing right." I began gathering the papers, one by one, slowly, deliberately. The sound of them sliding together filled the stillness. I could feel the weight of years lifting, the ache of silence leaving my bones. Daniel stood suddenly. "He'll make it right," he said, voice cracking like an old promise finally breaking free. I nodded. "You'll have your chance. Start by showing up, not as heirs, but as children." They watched as I walked toward the exit, the sound of my cane tapping softly against the stone floor. Each step felt lighter than the last. Outside, the sun had begun to set, scattering orange light across the horizon. The air smelled of rain, clean and new, the kind of air that follows storms and promises peace. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I didn't feel forgotten. I felt home. The church door closed behind me with a quiet click. Not an ending, but the beginning of a new chapter written in my own name.
The days that followed felt quieter, not empty, but peaceful. The farmhouse, once echoing with tension and unspoken hurt, now breathed differently. Morning light slipped through the curtains like forgiveness, soft and golden. I still made my tea the same way,
1 spoon of honey, a dash of cinnamon, but it tasted different now. Lighter. Freer. Sometimes, silence isn't loneliness, it's healing. Daniel visited first. He came without the expensive suit, without the usual phone in hand. Just himself, a son, trying to remember how to be one. We sat by the porch, talking about nothing and everything. He apologized, not with grand words, but with presence. I could feel the sincerity in the way he stayed long after the tea had gone cold. Maris came next, her children in tow. The little ones ran through the house, filling it with laughter I hadn't heard in years. When she hugged me, it wasn't out of guilt. It was gratitude, a quiet promise to do better. And Victoria, well, she didn't come right away. But one evening, a small envelope arrived. Inside, a single photograph. Her standing in front of the church, head bowed, no words written on the back. Sometimes silence speaks the loudest. I walked to the window, watching the sky turn rose and lavender. The world was still flawed, still uncertain, but I had found my footing again, the kind built not on wealth or approval, but on peace. They say old age softens you. Maybe that's true, but I've learned something else. It sharpens your heart, too. You begin to see what really matters. Love that's earned, respect that's mutual, and boundaries drawn not from anger, but from wisdom. I took a deep breath, smiled, and whispered to the evening air. I didn't lose my family. I just helped them find their way back. And as the last light faded beyond the fields, the farmhouse glowed, not from lamps, but from the quiet strength of a woman who had finally remembered her worth. Because sometimes the loudest revenge is simply peace.